should be it. It says meeting is now live on Facebook.
Okay. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I hope I did it right. Okay, so tell us what's going on with Bill 3.
All right. Well, I really appreciate, Crystal, you and all of your tech support team, the work that you've done to put this together. And I'm really pleased to give folks in Twin Parks an update since we had our town hall meeting. And honestly, that was only, what, a couple of months ago, but it feels like forever ago. We took the feedback that we heard from folks in Twin Parks, as well as the feedback that our other MLAs heard from other folks in mobile home sites in their constituencies. And we used that feedback to create some amendments to the Mobile Home Sites Tenancy Act that was being debated. And as you know, that act gives mobile home site tenants and landlords the ability to go to the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service instead of going to court to resolve issues related to mobile home site tenancies. We created, like I said, a few amendments that we thought would improve the bill. And I just, if you're okay with it, Crystal, I just wanted to go through a summary of the amendments and then explain what happened to them. Or I don't know, how do you want to do this?
And I need to kind of go over the basics because a lot of people don't really understand how the bills even go through legislation. So they don't even understand first, second, third reading. They don't understand it. So yeah, the more information you can get, the better.
Sure. So yeah, and thank you for that. You know, when I work in this stuff every day, it's easy for me to forget that the legislature is a weird place with weird rules that not everybody understands. So the way it works, it's not just for the Mobile Home Sites Tenancy Act, it's for every piece of legislation. The government brings forward the legislation for the legislature to consider, and it goes through 4 different stages. At first reading, it's just introduced, so the minister will stand up and say, I'm introducing this piece of legislation, this is what it's intended to do, and there's no other debate allowed at that point. And by tradition, we all vote in favor of legislation that's introduced at first reading because we want to be able to engage in debate. So then at second reading, you can debate the merits of the principle behind the bill. So is this legislation a good idea in principle or not? Then members vote on the bill, and then it proceeds. Then it proceeds to the third stage, which is called Committee of the Whole. And that's the stage where members of the legislature have the ability to change the legislation. And that was the work that we had put in together, Crystal, with the people who attended that town hall to come up with some ideas for amendments that I could bring forward as the Maple Oak Ridge representative in the legislature. So we brought forward a number of amendments, like I said, not just ones created by folks at Maple Oak Ridge, but from all across the province. And then the bill goes to third reading, which is, okay, we've had the opportunity to debate whether or not the bill is a good idea. We've had the opportunity to look at some amendments. Maybe some of them have been adopted or not. And then at third reading, we say, well, after all of this discussion, is this still a good idea? Should we go forward with it or not? And then it's voted out. Now, it's important for this discussion on the mobile home site tenancy piece to understand that even though a bill has passed third reading, that doesn't mean that it comes into force. It doesn't come into force until the legislation says it comes into force. So sometimes it comes into force immediately upon passing third reading. Sometimes it comes into force when the Lieutenant Governor grants royal assent. And most often, pieces of legislation only come law when they're proclaimed. And that's the Premier and the Cabinet say, okay, we've decided that now that this law that's been passed by the legislature will come into effect. And there are lots of pieces of legislation that have been passed by the legislature that have not been proclaimed. And we'll get into a piece of that actually is relevant to this mobile home sites tenancy amendment with respect to the value of the dispute that can be heard by the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service.
Good.
So that's a brief overview of the legislative process here in Alberta.
Good. Thank you. So we're in our third reading. That I never got to watch the legislature. Like I said, all the internet went down. So that's what happened today, right?
Yeah, so we ended the committee the whole stage. So we brought forward all of our amendments. They were considered, and if we want to maintain some sense of suspense, I can hold off on what happened with all of those until later.
Okay,
but we're out of committee of the whole stage, and now we're in third reading, and we expect that this legislation will pass third reading this week. That's the government's intent.
Okay. So then, what is your amendment? What did you guys propose? Do you want to talk about that?
Right. I do, and forgive me for looking away from the screen because I've got some notes here on my phone. So we brought forward as a caucus 6 amendments, and some of those things were generated by the discussion that we had with folks in the village. One of the amendments was to clarify that the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service had the authority to listen to disputes regarding the disclosure of fees, charges, or assessments payable by a tenant in addition to rent, as well as any disputes relating to a landlord's covenant to supply and maintain electric, plumbing, sanitary, heating, fuel, and other facilities in a sound and fit manner. So this was an amendment that was generated certainly by the discussion in Maple Oak Ridge, that you guys are often hit with fees and utility charges that you have no idea what they're for. You don't know why you're being charged, and you don't know why you have to pay them.
That's correct.
And so we wanted to make sure that the legislation explicitly stated that the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service had the authority to hear these matters. Unfortunately, the government didn't think that that was a very good idea. They said that it's implied in the legislation that Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service does have the authority to hear these matters. So they defeated the amendment. Now, it's never clear to me if, in my view, if the law can do a thing and we're just clarifying, we're just saying that it can actually do the thing that it's supposed to do, what's the harm in passing the legislation? They didn't really provide us with a satisfactory answer to that question, but they defeated that amendment. So that was one of the amendments that we brought forward. Now, another one that we brought forward, sorry, that was, oh, right. So Another amendment that we brought forward was we understand that there are lots of mobile home site tenants who already have cases that are in the works, right? They're in front of a court. They haven't been resolved, and they, but they're not going forward, right? They're just stalled in court, and so we brought forward an amendment that would allow people who are in this position to apply to have the residential tenancy dispute resolution service hear the matter instead of going to court. Unfortunately, the government didn't agree that this was a good idea. You know, they tried to create some procedural arguments around the fact that a matter could be dropped and then brought forward to the residential tenancy dispute resolution service instead. I frankly don't buy it. But anyway, that was their explanation. And so unfortunately, what this means is that even though the bill has been passed and once it comes into force, mobile home site tenants will be able to have their matters heard before dispute resolution service. That won't apply to tenants who already have matters that are before court. So, you know, that's going to leave a lot of tenants in a bad position trying to fight these issues with the sky-high legal fees and court costs and all those kinds of things. We also brought forward an amendment that said that while a matter was being heard by a residential tenancy dispute resolution service, that you couldn't increase the rent payable or charge any other kinds of fees or those sorts of things, because we'd certainly heard from some folks that landlords tend to punish folks who bring these disputes forward by slapping them with rent increases and these fees and that kind of thing. That amendment was defeated as well, without really any adequate explanation. I think that unfortunately the minister didn't provide much comment on that, on why they didn't seem to think that was a good idea.
While we're talking about rent,
yeah,
the rent freeze, the eviction freeze was just up on April 30th, and they did not renew that. They didn't keep that going.
No, and sorry.
Don't continue on. Yeah, I really want to make it clear what people, just in my community, they are sort of working with tenants, kind of. So I just want to make it clear, and if you could explain the rights that people do have till the end of June.
Yeah, so it's true. The eviction ban ended April 30th. So between when the eviction ban came in place and that was the middle of March, sometime until the end of April, tenants couldn't be evicted from either mobile home sites or apartment buildings or any other kind of residential tenancy for non-payment rent. But now that eviction has expired, everybody's expected to pay their rent, regardless of their ability to pay. The only condition that the government has put on them is that the landlord has to make an effort to come to a payment agreement with the tenant, and then in order to apply for eviction, they have to show that the tenant didn't comply with wouldn't come to an agreement or didn't comply with the terms of the agreement. So it's not as straightforward as evicting somebody for non-payment of rent before the pandemic hit, but it's not an outright eviction ban, and it's really unclear how a court or a tenancy dispute resolution service is going to determine whether or not a landlord was being reasonable in coming up with an agreement. And my fear, I've certainly heard stories from people who rent in all kinds of situations that their landlords are either they don't know that that's the case, or they do and they're not telling their tenants that to try to force them out without knowing their full rights. So it's really important that everybody in Maple Oak Ridge understand what their rights are when dealing with their landlord right now. That they, if you can't pay your rent, the landlord does have to come to the table and try to work out a payment agreement with people who are in that situation.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
So back to the amendments. So we covered the rent increases. We covered moving things that are currently before a court to the dispute resolution service. We covered the utility charges thing. There was one, whoops, sorry, my phone's doing all kinds of stuff here. Oh, right. So one of the issues that we'd talked about, Crystal, after we had the meeting was the issue around fees being charged for the applying to the dispute resolution service. And we understand that you were quite clear, and so were the folks from Evergreen, that you wanted to be treated the same as any other residential tenant and pay the same fees. That was before the pandemic hit.
That's correct.
And so after the pandemic hit, we decided, well, we should probably at least use this platform to push for them to remove the fees to apply to the residential tenancy dispute resolution service for mobile home sites. and you know, hopefully that they would also take that then and apply to residential tenants as well. Now, the minister refused to pass that amendment. He did say that the residential tenancy dispute resolution service does have the discretion to waive the fees. So it's important for everybody in Maple Oak Ridge to know that you can apply to have your fees waived if you're in financial distress and can't afford I think it's a $75 fee right now to do that. I've had a look at the form. It's 2 pages long. Like, honestly, I've had tax returns that are shorter than this form. So it's not an easy process. But I think it's important for people to at least know that there is a process for them to apply to have the fees waived if they can't afford to take a dispute forward. Because we know that there are lots of folks right now who are lost their jobs, have no money coming in, still having disputes with their landlords, and have a right to be heard, frankly. So it's important to know that avenue exists.
My concern is vice versa. For the management company, it's only $75. They're billion-dollar corporations, and it's only $75 for them to file against us. That is nothing when they've been paying these hundreds of dollars to take tenants to court.
And that was something that came up in the debate that irked me a little bit, Crystal. You know, the minister justified a fee, saying that it was a way to block frivolous suits from being filed. And I said, well, hey, it will only block people who can't afford to come up with the $75 from launching a suit. And if you've got $1 billion corporation, you can file those suits all day long if you want. And you know, he acknowledged that was the case, but didn't seem to be concerned about that power imbalance. So the two really critical amendments, in my view, not that, I mean, all of these are important and would have made the legislation better, but the ones that were really fundamental to making this work, I think, were, one, the limit on the cash value that that can be heard. So right now, the RTDRS is limited to hearing matters that are only valued at $50,000 or less. And it's important to understand the reason behind that. So right now, these matters that are valued at $50,000 or less would normally go to a provincial court. And the Residential Tenancy Dispute Resolution Service is set up as an alternative dispute resolution service for the provincial court. And under residential tenancy and the Mobile Home Sites Act, the provincial court is designated as the court that hears these things. So when we brought forward this amendment, they said, well, provincial court can only hear matters that are valued at $50,000 or less. So they said that this amendment was out of order because it would require a change in the law to the Provincial Court Act that limits that value at $50,000. Interestingly, the act that governs the provincial court has already been amended to allow the provincial court to hear matters that are valued at $100,000 or less. But that has never been proclaimed. So it's on the books. The legislature has passed legislation that allows provincial court to hear matters up to $100,000, but the government hasn't proclaimed that. So just a suggestion for you and other mobile home site tenants, that might be an area for you to focus your advocacy efforts. Just get the government to proclaim the section of the Provincial Court Act that raises the limit of the value of the matters that can be heard to $100,000.
And you too, Marlin, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I'm not saying that my job is done and I'm out of here, but we're recognizing that we all need to work together because I'm just one person, and the more people we have demanding the same thing, the more likely we are to get that change. The final amendment that we brought forward was with respect to the coming into force of this legislation. So in the discussion around the rules of the legislature and how a bill becomes a law, I said that a bill comes into law often upon proclamation, and that was the case with this legislation, that it will only be coming to effect when it's proclaimed. And we tried to amend it so that it would come into effect immediately upon once it was passed and the Lieutenant Governor gives royal assent, which is usually a day or two after it's passed, then it would become law. So that mobile home site tenants would have access to the dispute resolution service right away. And honestly, I thought that they would. I thought that they would take this amendment and pass it, because they did reconvene the legislature in April specifically to pass this legislation because they said it was urgent. But when we pushed them on it and said, well, if it's urgent, make sure that it becomes law as soon as possible, they declined that opportunity. So I was really disappointed to see that. So it's important that we continue that you and I and everybody else continue to press the government to proclaim this law right away, so that these matters can be heard before a residential tenancy dispute resolution service.
Now, you said when it's proclaimed, but that could be at any point.
Yeah, it could be at any point. And the piece around the Provincial Court Act and the limit of the value of the matters that it could hear. So that was passed in 2015, and it's 5 years later and it hasn't been proclaimed yet.
Right. So we could be talking 5-10 years down the road.
We don't know. We asked the government during debate when they intended to make this dispute resolution service available, and they said, well, in the near future. And they said, talked about all of the things that need to be done to make sure that the dispute resolution service is able to hear these things. And you know, I understand that there is some resourcing that needs to go into, because all of a sudden you've got thousands and thousands of mobile home site tenants who are eligible for the service. But that doesn't mean that they can wait very long, in my view.
So this does not address any of our infrastructure concerns. It didn't address lifting that cap, so we'll have to continue advocating for that. It didn't address any of our road or sewer issues or anything, and we don't know when it's going to take effect.
You've summarized it exactly, Crystal.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, it was a really frustrating debate. I won't lie.
We watched you, Marlin. I know that you worked very, very hard, and we really appreciate you helping us in every way. But yeah, I guess we don't know what happens now. We just wait and see.
So yeah, that's right. We don't. So as I said before, the bill has to pass third reading. We anticipate that that will be finished sometime this week, either tomorrow or Friday. We don't know exactly when, but either of those days. And then I think it's important, once it's passed. I'm certainly going to be sending a letter to the minister, asking him to at least commit to proclaiming the legislation, or getting cabinet to proclaim it, and reminding him about the Provincial Court Act proclamation. Those are the two things that the government could do tomorrow if it wanted, right? We just have to have a cabinet meeting and say, hey, this is the law now. So,
the Provincial Act is the one at 100,000, right?
Provincial Court Act, yeah.
Okay, you know what my next task is going to be. Thank you so much, Marlin.
Well, Crystal, thank you, and I want to thank everybody in Maple Oak Ridge for coming out and participating in the process. I'm like I said, I'm really disappointed that we didn't get the things that we wanted out of this process, but I think it's important for people to remember that if we hadn't done anything, we wouldn't have got anything. And,
well,
and there's
right.
still and there's still an opportunity, I think, to continue to push for things.
That's correct. In the end, we are going to have access to the RTDRS,
Yep.
and that is, one step much further than we ever were.
Yeah, 100%, and that's why we voted ultimately in favor of the legislation anyway, because we know that it's a step forward for mobile home site tenants. But, it could have been better in my view. So.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Marlin. Take care.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal, and thanks everybody. I hope you stay healthy and safe.
You as well. See you.
Okay. Bye.